Hi everyone. For our group presentation, we will be exploring the neuroplasticity of addiction and how drug abuse changes the brain. Addiction is a major public health issue that affects millions of people worldwide, and knowing how addiction affects the brain is key to understanding why it is so difficult to overcome. My name is Cassandra, and I'll start by introducing our topic, explaining our research question, and going over the key background information needed to understand how addiction alters normal brain circuits. After that, Sydney and Jacob will build on this foundation by presenting findings from primary research studies and discussing how those findings relate to our research question in terms of understanding addiction, treatment, and recovery. When we talk about addiction, it's important to shift our view of how we think about it. Addiction isn't just a lack of self-control or poor decision-making. It is considered a chronic relapsing brain disorder. People with addiction often continue using drugs even when they're aware of the negative consequences, and that's because repeated drug use causes long-lasting changes in the brain. These changes often affect circuits involved in reward, motivation, learning, and self-control, which helps explain why addiction can be so persistent and why relapse is so common. Our research question is, what are the neurobiological bases of addiction and how do drugs of abuse alter normal brain circuits? This question matters because addiction represents a serious real-world problem, not just for individuals, but also for families, healthcare systems, and society as a whole. By focusing on the brain mechanisms involved, this question helps explain key features of addiction, like cravings, tolerance, withdrawal, and relapse. Understanding these neurobiological changes also provides a scientific framework for developing more effective and targeted treatments. Based on the literature review that we conducted, here are some key takeaways highlighting the neuroscience of addiction. A large body of research points to the brain's reward system as being central to addiction, especially the dopamine reward pathway. Now, under normal conditions, dopamine plays an important role in motivation and learning by reinforcing behaviors that are important for survival, like eating or social interactions. However, drugs of abuse hijack this system. Even though each addictive substance acts through different molecular mechanisms, all of them ultimately alter the release of dopamine in a brain region called the nucleus accumbens. This area is part of the brain's reward pathway, which is sensitive to experiences that give us pleasure and drives us to repeatedly seek them out. The reward pathway is essential to our well-being, but addictive substances can also exploit it. These dopamine surges are much stronger than those produced by natural rewards, which causes the brain to adapt over time. With repeated drug use, these adaptations lead to changes in synaptic plasticity and weaken the brain's control systems, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. This makes it harder to regulate impulses and helps explain the shift from voluntary drug use to compulsive drug-seeking behavior. Even though we've learned a lot about the brain circuits involved in addiction, there are still important gaps in our understanding. One major question is why some individuals are more susceptible to addiction than others, even when they're exposed to the same substances. This suggests that genetics, environment, and even life experiences all interact together to influence risk. Another question is which drug-related brain changes can actually heal with recovery. Understanding the brain's capacity for recovery and neuroplasticity is critical for developing more effective and personalized treatments. So while we understand many of the key brain mechanisms involved in addiction, there's still a lot we're actively learning. This sets the stage for the next part of our presentation, where Sydney will walk us through findings from primary research studies.
All right. In this section, we will be discussing our primary research article, which is Cocaine Cues and Dopamine in Dorsal Striatum, the Mechanism of Craving in Cocaine Addiction. This is an experiment done by Volkow et al., who wanted to discover why subjects struggling with cocaine addiction had a compulsive urge to partake when exposed to certain drug-associated cues. These cues can include places where they've taken the drugs. It can include people with whom they've taken the drug in the past, as well as materials that are used to procure and or administer the drug. They hypothesized that exposing subjects to drug-related cues would increase extracellular dopamine and striatum in proportion to the increase in cocaine craving, as well as subjects with more extreme addiction having a larger dopamine increase in response to stimuli as opposed to subjects with a less severe addiction. To test this, they recruited 18 cocaine-addicted subjects. They used the DSM-4 questionnaire and criteria for cocaine dependence, which essentially just requires that subjects have been active users of cocaine for at least the past 6 months. They also used the questionnaire to determine the level of cravings they were experiencing at the start and end of stimuli videos, as well as questionnaires that measured their severity of addiction. Essentially, over the course of 2 non-consecutive days, subjects filled out each questionnaire for their cravings and severity of addiction, and were then taken to take a PET scan and were shown 2 different videos. On one day, they were shown a neutral video that was essentially just nature scenery, and then on the other day, they were shown a video depicting the simulated smoking of crack cocaine. At the end of each video, after their PET scan, subjects filled out the cravings and severity questionnaire once again. After performing the PET scan, they looked at areas such as the ventral striatum and cerebellum in an image analysis and determined the concentration of dopamine in the brain. This concentration was then quantified as a percentage change during their statistical analysis, and they found that the cocaine video significantly increased both dopamine concentration and craving scores, whereas the neutral video did not. They also found that the severity of addiction scores found at the start of the experiment directly correlated with the increase of dopamine in subjects. Those individuals that scored higher in addiction severity on their questionnaires had a larger dopamine increase after watching the cocaine video, as opposed to the less severely addicted individuals. This shows that in severely addicted individuals, when they are exposed to anything associated with the drug, intense cravings are triggered, which makes it more difficult to self-regulate. Essentially, these individuals are primed to engage in the behaviors required to procure the drug. This implies that as an individual becomes more and more addicted to the drug, they become more and more susceptible to the dopamine increases and find themselves compelled to seek out the drug, which furthers their addiction. This does support our hypothesis that repeated exposures to the drugs leads to compulsive drug-seeking behavior, especially when exposed to drug-related cues.
Considering these results, we were able to prove our hypothesis and thus conclude that repeated drug use and prolonged exposure to drugs of abuse creates drug-seeking behavior. As we were able to see in the research article, this is due to the neuroplastic change that occurs in the brain due to the gradual increase of dopamine, which is triggered when an addicted individual is exposed to their particular substance of abuse. This proves that pathways were developed to create a repeating cycle in the brain whenever that particular substance is shown to that individual. The significance of this is that while neuroplasticity has been known to be beneficial, it may also create damaging pathways if the repeated action proves harmful to mind or body. In the book Never Enough by Judith Grisel, she informs us that the fundamental role of the brain is to be a contrast detector, or in other words, an alarm for when we leave homeostasis. This is what Judith refers to as a set point, and it is what helps us return to what is physically normal for our bodies. However, as addictive substances take a greater hold over their participants, that set point becomes clouded and corroded, and it becomes more and more difficult to live without the substance of abuse. So, the greatest takeaway from reviewing this research is that since we know our brains are plastic and are susceptible to change in such drastic measures, there should be greater care given to prevent the creation of these damaging neural pathways. Thank you for your attention, and here are the articles we were using in reference.